Moderating the library management track today, and assisting me is Ann Hamlin with the Wisconsin Valley Library System. We're glad to have you here this afternoon at our second to the last session of today's webinars conference. Our presenter for this session is Vanessa Christman with the Riverside County Law Library in California. And she will be discussing the pitfalls and opportunities inherent in managing a multi-generational library staff. Vanessa, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to my presentation today. As it was mentioned, my name is Vanessa Christman, and I am with the Riverside County Law Library. I am a public services librarian. And just a little thing about public law libraries, I'm not sure actually if Wisconsin has some. I'm sure they may, but we're essentially a public library, but with legal collection, and we cater to people who try to represent themselves in court or want legal information. It's a very, very recent job change for me. Since prior to this, I was the assistant director at the Riverside City Library System. And it is as you will later learn, it is a very millennial thing of me to change jobs so frequently, but thankfully I'm in the same area this time. I've been working in public libraries since 2005, and I've worked as a librarian or an administrator in exclusively public or public law libraries. So I do go back and forth quite a bit. It's actually a pleasure to meet you, and it's a pleasure to come back to this conference and present again. So I've actually presented at this conference before years ago, and I did a presentation on customer service. I remember that this was one of my favorite speaking engagements because I believe I was paid in chocolate instead of in money, which are, of course, my same terms for this year. But I was asked back this year because of a series of presentations I made with my former boss, Sarah Houghton, about a Gen X and millennial management team, and that presentation was in 2014 or 2015. Our presentation was called Rise of the Young'uns. And we ended up doing a lot of research on generations in the workplace, which is why I thought that this presentation today that I was asked to come back and present to you all was going to be a cakewalk for me because of that prior research. But, a funny thing happened on my way to create and present this presentation. I decided to take another, quick look at the newer studies on generations in the workplace, studies from 2017 onwards. And, it pretty much changed my entire outlook on this topic. There's apparently so much that can change in generations in the workplace research in just half a decade. So I am saying welcome to the journey because this presentation is brand new. It's an exclusive to this conference, and it's both a presentation along the lines of what I said it was going to be and the description, and kind of a journey of sorts into what I thought I understood about generations in the workplace and how that's actually really evolved. So welcome to our collective journey into generations in the workplace. But first, let's start with kind of an overview of the generations that I am going to be speaking about. Let's quickly review. I decided to take the quote-unquote traditionalists, aka the generation before the baby boomers, out of the conversation because they are such a small fraction of today's workforce. We're going to be discussing the baby boomers, and you see kind of the age, these are generally agreed upon age year ranges, though it will change based on the research slightly. So boomers, Generation X, millennials, or also called Gen Y in the research. I think millennials is really a specific term to the United States. Gen Z, and also we're adding Gen Z, or they're also called Zoomers, kind of jokingly. Gen Z is a brand new generation being added into my presentation, and though they're also a small percentage of the workforce, their numbers are increasing exponentially, and generational and workplace characteristics are just beginning to be studied. So to summarize, the older tip top of the workforce we're discussing here are currently 75, and the youngest are 16 or 17. The youngest members of Gen Z are turning 10 this year, so they have not quite entered the workforce. Although you would think my 11-year-old son would be entering the workforce with all he complains about my chores. So I did promise memes in the presentation, in the description, and I promise you I will deliver. But you know, as an elder stateswoman of the millennial generation, I pretty much refuse to do presentations unless I can include a meme or some other fun way to engage my legendarily short attention span. And if you're active on Twitter and other social media platforms, generational memes have been around since almost the dawn of memeing. But since Gen Z is online and very prolific online, they're leading the charge in getting generational memes back into the public discourse. So in order to give you a sense of popular online perceptions of the current generations in the workplace, we're going to look at my perfectly curated generational memes and contrast those with what the research says about observed and studied generational characteristics. But let's start in order of generation, which means we'll start with the current and hottest of generational memes online at the moment. Okay, Boomer. So, okay, Boomer, as you all know, okay, Boomer is a meme, and it's a put down used to respond to posts by perceived baby boomers, particularly baby boomer posters who tend to have what other generations consider as a dismissive or maybe at best naive view of the challenges faced by other generations. So for those of you stung by OK Boomer, if you've been stung by it online with friends and family members, it may help you a bit to know that there's a whole genre of kind of like sub-memes about members of the Gen Z who deploy OK Boomer against pretty much anybody who's older than them. You know, if you're Gen Z, even millennials. So if a 16-year-old thinks you're old, you're eligible for the OK Boomer treatment, regardless of what your age is. But actually to the left, I included my favorite kind of an earlier baby boomer meme. It's kind of the OG OK Boomer. So allow me to introduce you to Old Economy Steve, a well-meaning but out-of-touch boomer who tries to use wildly irrelevant examples about how kids these days shouldn't complain about the economic hand they've been dealt, because, you know, they've had it rough too. I actually think some of the most scathing memes about boomers come in the form of reposted little Twitter remarks or burns, as I have included here. I think the one that's the most painful to me is the one about the generation who linoleumed over all those beautiful hardwood floors. That was a particularly devastating burn, I think, for boomers, especially since I've lived in plenty of houses with linoleumed hardwood floors. But just absorbing these memes, you get the point, right? The outside perception of boomers is that they're out of touch. Maybe they're hypocrites who deny the reality of kind of what the hardships that the successive generations have had to endure, while benefiting from the perks of earlier times. So what does the actual research say about baby boomers? So, you know, on the left, I've kind of included a list of stereotypes and cliches that you can infer from being active online, reading memes about baby boomers, even just talking to members of younger generations. You know, baby boomers are selfish, entitled, out of touch, materialistic, judgmental, and all about kind of promoting themselves to the detriment of others. But the generational traits from research from both, you know, 2015 when I did my earlier presentation and now have a lot to say about actually observed characteristics of baby boomers, particularly how they interact with others in the workplace. So optimistic, baby boomers have a Pollyanna streak. They've seen some hard stuff happen in their generation, and they know that the good and the bad ebb and flows. Perhaps optimism is a kind of a generous interpretation of how others perceive boomers to be dismissive of generational difficulties. Also, hypersensitive. This was interesting. So there was a large 2019 study from the Journal of Psychology and Aging, and it studied narcissistic traits among members of all of the current generations of the workforce, and found that boomers had the highest level of hypersensitivity, which is one of the many measures of narcissistic personality traits. That's actually really interesting, and it can kind of, maybe, if you want to read a little bit into it, maybe explain some of the backlash to OK Boomer, which is just a kind of a casual phrase on the internet that's essentially nothing, that there's been a lot of backlash to it. You know, self-absorption, I think, goes hand in hand with kind of some of the observed hypersensitivity, narcissistic traits. And more than other generations, boomers display more concerns for things that impact their generation as opposed to others. A lot of the research, things that are prevalent in the research of this are in discussions of which benefits are offered to a generation or an organization's employees. Boomers tend to skew towards wanting the workplace to still continue to offer the types of benefits that are most relevant to members of their generation as they're on kind of the precipice of retirement, and you know, at the detriment of company benefits that may actually engage and retain newer, younger workers. And that's some pretty hot topics in literature right now. On the very positive side, boomers have an exceptionally hard work ethic. One study I read made me chuckle. That kind of made me chuckle is how boomers have no time and need for all those flashy perks and gifts that the tech companies offer their employees. They just fundamentally don't get it, because they understand that their job is to get to work and work as hard as they can and give their all to their organization, and then go home and enjoy their families and their lives. They don't need a lot of games and gimmicks at work. They just want to do a good job. You know, boomers have a lot of value for the traditions and systems in a workplace, and are excellent at relationship building, soft skills, and small group communication, so AKA meetings. This is great news for younger generations in the workplace, as boomers really tend to value opportunities to share their knowledge and to mentor and help others grow within the organization. So I think we're beginning to see, and I think you'll start to see, that the stereotypes don't necessarily match the observed traits from research about generations in the workplace. So next generation is Gen X, and it's a generation that I feel is very, very overlooked in the generational discourse. As many of you know, one of the most popular movies to talk about Gen X, Dazed and Confused, The Breakfast Club, all of those movies that my Gen X husband loves to point out are, you know, written by baby boomers about Gen X. So it's a very Gen X thing to say. But, you know, Gen X has actually escaped excessive memeing online. As the Star Wars meme kind of illustrates above, Gen X prefers to wait it out while everyone else is kind of wasting their time fighting. Gen X stereotypes all center around the characteristics of that were associated with Gen X's younger people: disaffected youth, latchkey kids whose parents were always working, cynical, skeptical people who saw the world economy collapse and didn't grow up with a lot of faith in their institutions. What's interesting, though, is how OK Boomer has expanded a bit to include Gen X with the meme OK Karen, as in Karen, the demanding middle-aged lady who wants to speak with your manager. A lot of the OK Karen memes use somebody who looks a lot like the main character in kind of that Kate+8, the kind of severe expression and blunt, choppy haircuts. You know, I was actually a little surprised to see Gen X described in terms of being complainers, but I guess it's not a far cry from being thought of as negative and disaffected. But actually, let's go to the next step and take a look at what the research says about Gen X. Okay, Karen. So stereotypes and cliches. Gen X is lazy, apathetic, cynical, negative. You know, they value authenticity, which kind of is summarized in the Gen X phrase, "Oh, I liked that band before it was cool." Generational, you know, the generational traits from research are actually kind of more of a positive spin on the characteristics that Gen X was known for in its youth. So, you know, Gen X really had to be individuals. They had to take care of themselves from young ages as latchkey kids. They're self-reliant, and they're not anti-authority as much as the research, and multiple studies actually use this phrase, ambivalent to authority. So you're not out there, fighting the man, but you're questioning. You're questioning authority because you prefer to work on your own and you're self-directed. Gen X in general, informal people who don't value old-fashioned workplaces as much as the prior generations. A lot of the earlier tech pioneers kind of created and pioneered the idea of all the engaging and fun employee perks like you see at Google. The two Google founders were Gen X, or kind of right in that cusp between Gen X and Boomer. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Gen X is pragmatic. They just like to get to the point when they're having discussions. They prefer a very small group communication or communication via email. They're really just big picture creativity focused people. And they're a lot of fun to work with if you've ever had a Gen X manager. And of course, these are all generalizations because your mileage may vary given the person in the situation. So next, let's talk about millennials. Millennials, here are some of the memes about millennials. The participation trophy generation. Millennials are clueless, coddled, spoiled, avocado toast loving. Millennials were the original generation memers. A lot of the mockery from the boomers calls millennials snowflakes, spoiled, and it's kind of a little bit funny given some of the recent research on baby boomer hypersensitivity. Millennials are the most debt-burdened generation in American history, and along with the inability to buy houses or make significant expenditures like their generational predecessors comes a lot of dark and angsty humor, as you'll see with kind of that Wheel of Fortune meme. Millennials take the meager spare income and invest it in experiences like avocado toast, which I have to say is something we kind of take for granted here in Southern California, since we're kind of the avocado capital of the United States. Charcuterie boards, nice restaurants, they have a little bit of spare income to spend on experiences because of how difficult it is to really invest themselves in a community due to the debt burden. What does the extensive millennial research say, though? I know it's probably anecdotal, but for every 5 studies on generations in the workplace, at least 4 of them are dedicated to millennials. So the research is exhaustive and overwhelming. But, honestly, in the difference between my prior presentation and now, their characteristics are shaping up to be a bit of a surprise in the workplace. So let's briefly review the stereotypes. Lazy, entitled, lack of common sense. They had the helicopter parents who are always hovering over them, checking up on them, making sure everything's okay, intervening with their teachers, etc. Tech savvy, but there's a lot of memes from boomers about millennials that are having them all holding their phones up and being mesmerized by technology. But that's not necessarily the case. The generational traits from the research are that millennials are confident, and some would say deservedly, and others would say maybe not. All of the coddling made them a generation that's pretty confident in their abilities in the workplace. Millennials get impatient with things when they don't see change often. They're actually really one of the only generations in the research that said that they actually looked at cycling through job responsibilities as a perk of the job. Other people like to kind of stick to their job and do it well. Millennials like to have a lot of different tasks and a lot of different areas to grow and focus on. Millennials are the best educated generation in the history of the United States, with a much higher percentage of people with college education and advanced degrees. So they're upbeat and achievement-oriented with a strong moral compass in the workplace. And one thing that's really different about millennials is in how they want feedback from their supervisors, which probably could be tied back to their upbringing. They have a well-defined need in the research for continuous feedback from managers. not periodically set meetings or performance evaluations that happen once or twice a year, but regular informal, but frequent checkups to ensure that they're on the right path and they're meeting expectations and they're doing a good job, which, I as a millennial, I completely agree with that, because I do like to know where my boss kind of stands with me. But I'm sure for other supervisors who are accustomed to a different way of doing business, it gets probably pretty exhausting sometimes. Also, as employees, they're known for wanting a lot of flexibility in how an assignment is completed, and they are adaptable to change. Like I said, this is all a series of generalizations from the research. Your mileage may vary with individual employees and situations. So I want to stay on the topic of millennials for just a moment and kind of have a bit of a public service announcement. Most millennials are over 30 now. You'll still see in popular culture how millennials are referred to as essentially the youngins who are wrecking all these different industries. Millennials are the death of chain restaurants, the death of diamonds, the death of, millennials are killing this and that, all these young people. I am an elder stateswoman of the millennial generation, and I am pushing 40. So most millennials are actually closer to middle age than they are to their 20s now. So I think it's time to move on from thinking of millennials as being these kind of young upstart whippersnappers, because that is not the case anymore. We're aging out of that role pretty rapidly. But speaking of the young whippersnappers, let's move on to Gen Z. So I love this quote about Gen Z from some of the research. They call them the best absurdists since Camus. Gen Z is an incredibly interesting generation, and they have really taken over memeing and made it just really weird. So Gen Z, as you'll see kind of to the left and everywhere, they're really all about kind of absurd, upbeat humor. They call them dank memes. I know I probably sound a million years old talking about this, and that's how I feel when I actually look at it. But it's a generation full of people who are constantly online, prolific posters. They are in their comfort zone when they are online with other people in various formats. They have a sense of humor that is kind of, I compare it to like almost like a more upbeat, optimistic Gen X with kind of an absurdist, absurdist streak. I think some of these memes really encapsulate just how online and how odd and funny Gen Z is. So there's actually not a lot of research yet on Gen Z in the workplace. The kind of the average age of a member of Gen Z who's in the workplace is 23 or 24. So the stereotypes about the generation is that they're constantly online. They're strange and disaffected. They're kind of growing up post the economic collapse, seeing what it's done to their friends, family, parents. They're confrontational online. They are the ones who really engineer the OK Boomer and do not hesitate to deploy it whenever they can. And they have a cliche of being really kind of hyper liberal, woke, etc. Constantly online fighting about things. The generational traits from the research, and there's not quite a lot of research yet because Gen Z is really just entering the workforce, is that, of course, they are constantly online, constantly connected, and it's not a big deal to them. It's kind of effortless. They're pragmatic and risk averse, which, it makes a complete amount of sense when they've seen the debt burden taken on by millennials and all of the education. Absurdist and individuals, as you could very clearly see in some of those Gen Z memes, they have a real kind of funny out there streak, and they like to engage in a lot of mockery, including self-mockery. They're diverse and open-minded, and they are very interested in kind of areas about environmental and social justice, and tend to gravitate towards employers who have that as a core value. So one area I did want to talk about that doesn't get talked about very often in the generational dialogue, and I'm not going to really relate this to workplace characteristics, but It's what's called sandwich generations. So generally the larger generations will have kind of a period of time where you're not sure if you're one generation or the next. So the first I want to talk about is Generation Jones. And Generation Jones, as in quote unquote, keeping up with the Joneses, that phrase that was used in the 1950s. You know you're a member of Generation Jones if you were young enough to really vividly remember the Vietnam War, actually old enough to vividly remember the Vietnam War, but not old enough to have served in it. So that's kind of a sandwich generation that shares a lot of the characteristics between baby boomers and Gen X. And another generation that's beginning to emerge and kind of be studied is the Oregon Trail generation. And they have a lot of actual names for it, but I prefer the Oregon Trail generation just because it reminds me of my own childhood nostalgia, and I am solidly in this generation. So it's the sandwich generation between Gen X and Millennials. And you know you are a member of this generation if you remember a time without personal computers in every home, but you primarily used them when you were in like high school and college aged. So to kind of recap, I wanted to talk about some of the things that we've been told about generations in the workplace. We've been told that generations in the workplace are, a really big issue. When I did my earlier presentation, that was kind of the central tenet of what we talked about how are all of these differences between employees. It impacts how we communicate and relate to one another. It impacts the working style and how you have to tailor your messaging and your discipline and your benefits. And, we have been led to believe prior to this research that generations in the workplace are a really huge, central, perplexing issue that employers need to address. And I pretty much entered this presentation with that premise in my head as well. And then I did a little bit more research. The newer research, and I am going to do one of those things where I shouldn't, where I actually read from a slide, it talks about the findings suggest that differences between generations in the workplace, at least in terms of preferences, have been exaggerated. Both early and later career professionals mostly want similar workplace attributes and professional development opportunities. So the summary that I wrote was workers of all generations have similar workplace values and needs, and generational differences amongst workers has been overstated. And, the more I read the research and kind of understand, the more I really have started to accept that, just because even in my own experiences in the workplace and how they've evolved over the past half a decade since my earlier presentations, one size fits all doesn't work to members of other generations. One size, attributing these stereotypes and cliches to your colleagues and coworkers is actually detrimental to the workplace, and it helps no one. But there are some traits that we can talk about that have been really supported by research. What I wanted to show you was a chart from one of the studies that I read, that is the IPMA HR survey of government employees. And I thought it was more appropriate to look for a survey of government employees because they're less likely to be including the types of perks and experiences that we just aren't able to have as government employees. So basically, there are 5 truly important workplace benefits that employees say that kind of keeps them engaged and wanting to stay in their workplace. So retirement plans and pensions, health benefits, compensation, work-life balance, and perks in the office. And I think this kind of visual shows you just how closely all members of the generation, each generation kind of value these types of perks in the office. They want the same things. It's just that their order of priorities about what they prefer over one benefit over another are the things that shift. So yeah, take a look at this really quickly, and you can, if you could tell me a huge difference here, I don't really see one, with the exception of what I mentioned earlier about baby boomers not being really engaged with having those flashy office perks. Another thing that I wanted to include is a visual about organizational philosophy, because baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, uh, they all pretty much have the same desires for an organization's philosophy as well. They want an environment that encourages employee input, a little bit more pronounced for millennials and others, organizations that recognize contributions, absolutely, providing training and opportunities. Baby boomers are, everybody wants training and opportunities to grow and develop, merit-based advancements, an environment that encourages autonomy. Your employer trusts you to do assignments and follow up. Organizational philosophy of hierarchical respect. That is an interesting one, and it does not show, it's not as big a priority as others. In an organization where tenure leads to promotions, well, that's not relevant to ours unless you work in an academic library. But you can see that the members of the prevalent generations in the workplace are all really engaged in wanting the same things and wanting to work for the same type of organization that has, these well-recognized set of philosophies and values. The one thing in the research that does come up, though, is that the differences between the generations in the workplace are in how the generations kind of communicate with one another and their colleagues, subordinates, and what motivates them to be engaged and stay in the workplace. Baby boomers, according to the research, like clear assignments. They like well-defined roles and tasks and responsibilities. They also do like flexibility. I think there's this sentiment out there that baby boomers aren't as interested in flexible working arrangements as, say, Gen X and millennials are. That's simply not the case. The research indicates that baby boomers do like to work from home, and they have other, things that they want to do outside of the workplace, and they appreciate that ability to be flexible with their working schedule and where they work as much as any of the other generations. Baby boomers have been well recognized in the research of having kind of a great ability to mentor and have those soft skills that help to really build people in the workplace. And so a lot of the literature that I've read recently talks about how great it is to include baby boomers in that informal mentoring programs. And also, baby boomers are, the generation that tends to prefer meetings. They do like one-on-one, and they like small group communication. Gen X, on the other hand, they very much want autonomy and flexibility, which is similar to baby boomers, but they want it more so. They prefer email and direct communication rather than small group meetings. They are very direct communicators, and they do want to work for an organization that really works to make a difference in their communities. They want to have, they're not as interested as hierarchical advancement as they are in working for an organization that has a big picture focus to make a difference. And they also, going back to flexibility, Gen Z is really Gen X is the generation that really pioneered the concept of working from home and having flexible work arrangements that suit their life. They're the generation that really works to live, as opposed to the boomers who like to live to work. Millennials also, following the lead of Gen X, millennials really do like and rank flexibility in working from home or having different shifts or assignments as one of their top priorities as well, because millennials are, getting up there. They have families and obligations as well, and they like to enjoy those perks. As I mentioned earlier, millennials are more likely to be interested in opportunities that ladder them up the hierarchical structure in a workplace. They actually enjoy varieties of assignments, not getting stuck to one kind of pigeonhole job, task, or assignment. They want feedback that is very, very frequent, the informal check-ins, how you doing, as opposed to the performance evaluation once a year. They like to work in collaborative groups. That's something that kind of reminds me of how I went to graduate school and how many kind of group assignments I was asked to do. And it was kind of necessary evil at the time, but it's something that we just grew accustomed to working with others to accomplish things. Millennials, and it's something in the literature that other generations don't really tend to have as well defined, they like to be, quote unquote, in the loop of an organization. So they like to know what's going on from the top to the bottom. And even if it's not their, quote unquote, role to know what's going on in upper management, they still want to know. They're very big on organizational transparency. And I know transparency means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but that's the generation that actually expresses that that is a very important aspect of the workplace, is to knowing what's going on with the big picture of the workplace. And they also value professional development because they are kind of middle career now. They're starting to want to grow and learn. In Gen Z, the research is sparse on Gen Z in the workplace because they haven't been in the workplace for very long. They also are tending to like flexible schedules like their predecessors, Millennials and Gen X. They also do like regular feedback, value collaboration. They essentially just expect a workplace that is diverse, and they are more interested in recognition and rewards than prior generations. And so with that, we've gone over the main differences between the generations in the workplace and how to maybe kind of tailor what you offer and how you provide feedback to those individuals. And I wanted to leave you, actually, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip to this next section where we talk about just how detrimental it can be to overvalue how important and how different people are in the workplace due to their generational differences. And so this is an article I found that I really recent, and it resonated with me. It's generational differences at work are small, and thinking that they're big actually affects our behavior in the workplace. And so there are two things that this study identified as being problems to how we relate and work with each other in the workplace due to kind of thinking that generational differences are a big deal. One of them is stereotypes, and stereotypes are other people's erroneous assumptions about our workplace capabilities. The second area, which I thought was a little bit more nuanced and really interesting, was what we think or worry that others believe about us based upon our age group. And I'll provide you some specific examples next. So I'll read you kind of an excerpt from it. The study found that stereotypes about older people's ability to learn new tasks interfered with the training that they received. When trainers believed that they were teaching an older person how to do a computer task, they had lower expectations and provided worse training than when they believed they were teaching a young person. And so I highlighted this next part. These results demonstrate that poor training is a direct result of age stereotypes. So generational stereotypes and thinking that they're kind of a big factor in the workplace actually leads to poorer results for those members of the older generations just because of those stereotypes. And then also back to the kind of topic of meta stereotypes, people's belief about whether others think about their age group interferes with their work behavior. There's a published study and examined how people react to meta stereotypes over the course of a work week. As expected, sometimes people react with a sense of challenge, and others report feeling it as a threat to themselves and their job, and whether or not they'll, the imposter syndrome. Will I ever be able to live up to these flawed, expectations of what my generation can and can't accomplish? And the way the literature showed that the way that really gets interferes in workplace collaboration and relationship building is in mentoring roles, where people who are mentees kind of enter the relationship almost with their guard up because they think that their older mentors have these really flawed assumptions about what they are and aren't capable of. And that kind of acts as a barrier to the mentor and the mentee really connecting. So generational stereotypes are really dangerous in the workplace. And that's what the literature is starting to really examine. There are very few differences between generations and what they want and need. And, thinking that there are a lot of differences is detrimental. And now I'm going to leave you with a quote from another article that I liked in INC magazine. Generational differences are more likely to reflect the stage of development of employees as opposed to their generation. So in other words, the difference between millennials versus boomers reflect changes in perceptions and expectations due to their age and career stage, whether they're just beginning or growing and wanting more tasks, rather than generational thinking or values. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions that you may have about my presentation. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Just got distracted by that final meme. It just got me there. So please remember to type in your questions, or if you have comments. We did have someone who was like so excited because they finally know now they are the Oregon Trail generation. So that was a very exciting moment of self-identification for someone. But if anyone has other questions, please type them in. I do have a question. When you were doing this research just basically about generations, did it talk much at all about variations in like people's lived experience that had nothing to do with their generation, and how that did that
you know, the
affect things at all? Does that make sense?
It did, and I saw the research about that, and the research about that was actually catered to surveying generational experiences in other countries, because your lived experiences are going to be different based upon the country that you live in. And so that's really what started researchers thinking that maybe, you know, all of these big picture stereotypical generational traits aren't specific to all the generations. So if you kind of take out the differences in the lived experiences, you're left with very few differences between, you know, the generations. So yeah, there is an emerging subset, particularly in business literature, when it's talking about how to, you know, international companies that want to try to offer one size fits all benefits in the United States to their, you know, employees in France or in Saudi Arabia. It's a really interesting form of research. So yes.
Okay, cool. Here's another. It'd be interesting to see comparisons of rural to semi-rural to urban people.
And I think that's fascinating. That's an excellent point, and I think that would be a really great research paper to talk about, especially since a lot of the research is catered to large organizations and large corporations, and those are, you know, disproportionately in a suburban or you know, really large city context. And so examining it from the perspective of a rural worker, I think would be absolutely fascinating. I might steal that idea.
Yeah, very cool. All right. We did have someone wondering if you have suggestions on facilitating effective multi-generational meetings.
Facilitating, so I would think, so I have to say I'm looking at this as a lens as a millennial, and I don't know if any of you have ever seen that. It's like a poster, some sort of meme that's like, I survived another meeting that should have been an email. And I very much kind of tend to agree with that. I would say that facilitating meetings, I think every generation wants a meeting that is well defined with, you know, agendas, goals for the meeting, and basically as short and concise as it can be. So I would say that, yeah, I think that's a good point, to make sure that your meetings are, you know, relevant, absolutely necessary, and they include opportunities for everybody to provide input. And if it's going to be a longer meeting, I know probably millennials would like an opportunity to kind of talk and learn from the others in the group as well. And I think the opportunity to provide feedback and kind of group discussions would be an excellent way to kind of cater to all contract conversations, taking the time frame. Absolutely, I think that's a very good summary of it. Yeah, so I would say as infrequent as you can, as informative and relevant, and opportunities for lots of people to provide feedback and make it quick to help Gen X go home.
Excellent. That's great. And I think, like what you were saying before, just what people want tends to be similar, like being, just the philosophy of the way a workplace works. And a lot of that translates to meetings. So that's really
Absolutely.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have someone who has a comment here. It seems like there's more difference in my library between generations of workers. Lots of silents and boomers recently retired. So now we have a lot of new people who don't see the need to do things the old way.
And I don't really have any way to help with that, but I think I'd say the observation is absolutely correct. They fundamentally do not see the reason to do things the old way by default. I know a lot of people come into an organization expecting people to just kind of pick up on rules and responsibilities by default because that's just the way it's been done, and that's the way that's like tradition and systems. I hate to be blunt, but that means nothing to Gen Z, and it means, next to nothing to millennials. So I think maybe sitting down and providing context with the rules, saying, this is why these rules developed over time. Maybe it's possible to be reevaluated at another point in time. Let me know. But that's something, the constant questioning of rules and the status quo. Yeah, that's kind of just the way millennials and Gen Z operate. So your observation is absolutely correct. They don't see any point in that. And I think the best way to get around that is to try to at least provide context as to why the rules were developed, and just come to expect that questioning isn't necessarily, sometimes it's being done with an intent to undermine and be difficult. Let's not lie. I've been an administrator long enough to know that happens. But it's just kind of the way that their brains are wired to work, to say, if something doesn't necessarily work for this situation or my experience, why can't we all work together to change it?
Okay.
It's tough in the government world.
Yes. And related to that, this person also said there are lots of unwritten rules that are just sort of assumed that people will know.
Yeah, so that's working in libraries. It happens to all of us. To me, that's very confusing and frustrating. That's kind of the more like the oral history of an organization as opposed to the written down rules and procedures. And that's something that younger generations have a fundamentally difficult time. They're more used to kind of accomplishing things online and collectively than they are with their colleagues in an organization. And considering that these generations are far more mobile, they tend to stay at the workplace, probably 3 to 4 years, whereas a lot of people who are the older generations, or even Gen X tends to stay a little bit longer too. They're going to actually get the sense of that institutional history, whereas it's just not going to be as relevant to younger generations. So it's going to, I think, communication, writing down and clarifying expectations, and I think that's where the continuous feedback comes in, which is, like I said, a little tedious and exhausting as the supervisor myself, but that helps to bring the younger generations along with kind of learning the oral history of the organization, and maybe coming to understand it. And yes, they will still question it. It is just the way.
Excellent. We have a couple other comments. Someone who's in their 50s can really understand all the ends of the generational spectrums, but they're Generation X, but they feel like they have a lot of Millennial and Gen Z qualities. And she also says you can learn valuable things from all the different spectrums. So
yeah, and
all those perspectives are worthwhile.
Absolutely, and that's why I think baby boomers in particular get a lot out of mentoring relationships with members of the younger generations, because they do understand too that everybody has something to contribute. And that's why I think organizations really need to look at leadership development and mentoring as a way to kind of promote cross-generational understanding. I think a lot of us work in smaller workplaces where we think we don't have the time and the money to invest in it, but it's actually one of the best ways to retain and grow younger workers is to provide those opportunities to learn from, you know, kind of the seasoned veterans of the profession.
All right, yay for mentoring. That's great. All right, anything else that anyone has been thinking about or wants to ask Vanessa while we have her here? Okay, if not, thank you so much, Vanessa. That was fascinating, and I for one found that your conclusion was I liked it. It made sense to me.
A bit of a twist, but
yeah, I like that.
It makes sense.
Yeah. So just in case you didn't hear this before, this session recording and slides will both be posted on the conference website by tomorrow. So you can look for that coming soon. Our closing session today for this fabulous conference is at 2:30 this afternoon with Amy Roman. And we hope you can join us. And if not, maybe you'll want to listen to the recording. And I think we're all set. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Vanessa.